Hey everybody, Rich Stroffolino here with Gestalt IT, and I wanted to talk to you about a new report that we saw out that shed some light on who exactly is using Slack and maybe also clarifies a little bit of the narrative that's been surrounding the company. I think since Slack went public, there's been a lot of scrutiny about the long term viability of Slack, where its users are coming from, how they're getting paid users, and perhaps most importantly, how they're competing with a competitor like Microsoft Teams. That's a very big competitor going up against Microsoft, who really gets productivity. Microsoft has a lot of issues around a lot of other products. If they ever come out with anything regarding mobile, be skeptical. When it comes to productivity, Microsoft is a pretty safe bet. So Slack, even though they have a very early lead, seemingly is going up against some very strong headwinds. One of the big concerns with Slack is how are they going to stay viable in that Fortune 500 space, right? That area of very large companies, very complex, that maybe want a little bit more top down organization. We've seen a number of reports saying that Microsoft Teams adoption is up in those areas, again, Fortune 1000, Fortune 500, those kinds of companies, whereas paid Slack users, even looking at their S1 filing, is an extremely small subset of their overall customer base. They have very strong adoption in that free tier. However, converting those users into paying customers is another matter entirely. We're looking at a survey of 200 startups, and out of those, 59% were paying to use Slack. Those aren't people that are considering using Slack or anything like that. These are funded startups that are paying currently to use Slack. That number is actually down a little bit from the last quarter, which was around 62%. However, it's been fluctuating in that high 50s, low 60s area, so it's not like this is an all time low or anything like that, just a little bit of a natural fluctuation there. Compare that to Microsoft Teams, which had a 12% market share among those same startups of people that are paying to use it. I think the reason we're seeing those numbers is for a lot of those smaller startups, the value in Office 365 isn't necessarily there. These may be very small teams that don't necessarily see the value in the overall management that you can get through Office 365, or quite frankly, don't need a full Office suite for what they are doing at this moment. It should be noted that Microsoft Teams market share is fairly high in that area, though, increasing from single digits, like I said, to that 12% figure. Still, Slack has a very strong lead, and it doesn't really show that it's slipping all that much over the past year, so that's an important win for them. When we're looking at large organizations, the situation is very much reversed, with 66% of organizations saying they're planning or have deployed Microsoft Teams versus just 33% for Slack. Perhaps more troubling for Slack, 13% of those organizations say they want to decrease spend on Slack versus just 1% with Microsoft Teams. That's a little problematic in my opinion because, like I said, Microsoft Teams is very much tied to Office 365, and there's a lot less variability that you have in terms of what you want to spend on Office 365. You're kind of locked in there if you're a large organization to depend on that Microsoft Office suite versus Slack, which, if you're again shifting to another product like Microsoft Teams, you can decrease that amount spent. So is the gravitational pull of Office 365 just that powerful that organizations are just gradually going to go to it, and we're only going to see startups maybe supporting Slack, and even then seeing that market share decline? I don't think it's quite that simple. I think a lot of it has to do with how Slack was introduced to the workplace in general. It was deployed in a lot of ways as a replacement for email, or at least billed that way after it had gained a little bit of market share. And when you first start using Slack, it does feel pretty special, at least compared to email, where you're going through multiple threads and you're trying to do asynchronous communication. Slack brings the beauty of a chat client into a little bit more of an organized structure, and it can be a really effective tool in the workplace. The problem is that, like any tool, if it's not used properly, if it's not set up properly, it gets chaotic very quickly. Anyone that's using Slack after a while has 5 or 6 teams that they're trying to use. They have all sorts of channels. They're not keeping up on stuff, and it becomes a burden to use after a while. And that's just because Slack has kind of grown organically to this point to a lot of organizations. It may be that it's not a top down thing. Maybe it's a small group of employees, or it's a nonprofit, or it's your gaming group, or it's a Kickstarter project that you backed, has a Slack group going on, and it's kind of a free for all. That's opposed to Microsoft Teams, which is very much a top down initiative. It's coming from the people that are giving you Office 365 in your workplace, and odds are it's not being deployed just to see what happens. There's probably a very set purpose for it. That means that a lot of people might not love Microsoft Teams, but it might be more effective in the workplace, especially when you're talking about larger organizations. I do think it's a little weird that Slack is touting its ability to scale beyond Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams has a limit of 5,000 members for any one Microsoft team overall group, and then having to integrate different 5,000 person teams together if you want to scale beyond that. Whereas Slack, with their new enterprise grid, can effectively scale infinitely. Although, if you're a member of a Slack group with over 5,000 members, I deeply, deeply pity you. So, what does the future hold for Slack? I don't know. I'm not as pessimistic as some other people. I do think it can be a very effective tool. They do have a very large user base that they can convert into paid tiers. I think a lot of it has to do with we just need to become used to these team messaging platforms, and they're still relatively new for a lot of people. I think there needs to be a lot more discipline with them, and from there, I think people will stop blaming Slack for when things get chaotic and just kind of learn how to use them. The question is, will that happen before Microsoft Teams sucks all the oxygen out of the room? That's another question, or if another player comes in. Anyway, those are my thoughts around those reports from Cruise Consulting, and I thought they were kind of interesting. Check out Gestalt IT for more IT coverage from across the enterprise. Thanks. Take it easy.